participate in this prestigious lecture series dating back to the first decade of Ghana's independence. To paraphrase Isaac Newton, I was struck by the giants on whose shoulders I would now stand to make my own modest contribution. Those who were here before me, their various fields of expertise, including my own compatriot, Professor Davidson Abiose-Nico, who did a similar speech here back in 1963, and I think I was probably in class 4 or 5 by then. From Professor Ali Alamin Mazrui, Africa's indefatigable spokesperson, to Arthur Lewis, the distinguished Nobel economist, to Kenneth Dike, the father of African historiography, to Gattari Spivak, the brilliant subaltern theorist, the lineup has been very impressive, and I feel honored that I'll be given this privilege and opportunity to interact with your faculty and students. I'm very pleased to see so many young people here. In fact, I chose the topic because of you. There is too much disaster, death, and disease shown on international television about Africa. There is little positive information. They take one incident in Burundi and they say it's Africa. But I wanted you, our children, the next generation, to have a lot of hope and see a lot of opportunity and have the confidence that you will transform this continent. Unlike many of our earlier speakers, I am no longer an academic. My experience over the past 3 decades has included academia, of course, but mostly in international development, public policy, and global governance. In fact, the last 10 years, I have dedicated more time building stakeholder partnerships, coalitions of the willing of governments, big corporations, and civil society to tackle major international problems, especially those related to energy transitions, sustainable industrial development, green growth, and climate change. I have chosen the topic, Africa is hot, for a very good reason. I knew I'll be talking to the best and the brightest from Ghana to give you the confidence that maybe sitting in this room we have another Bill Gates or Zuck. The title was Ghana, Defying the Garden of Eden Syndrome. Ali Mazrui, one of his books and television series in 81, was trying to explain some of the problems in Africa. And one of the things he said was that sometimes people believed we had a Garden of Eden syndrome. Everything can grow in Africa. You know, and we were endowed with all these natural resources. So some have argued that because we have so much, we've not been very creative. And they argue that if you live in the temperate climate, you have no choice but to be creative on clothing and better building material because it gets cold for 6 months. They said also if you were in the temperate zone, you would have to find a way to do storage of food, processing of food, because you will have that 6-month period where you can, when you can processing of food, because you will have that 6-month period where you can, when you can grow food. So unlike Africa, tropics, everything grows. Every season we have food and we have all these natural resources. People called it the Garden of Eden syndrome. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. But when Ghana discovered that oil wells, I started worrying. I said, will they suffer from the natural resource course? Countries discover an abundant natural resource, they forget everything. So I was worried that Ghana, the great agricultural base, one of the big bases of agriculture in Africa, might ignore agriculture. It's not uncommon. It happened to us in Sierra Leone. We used to export rice in the 50s. We discovered diamonds, we forgot about that. It happened in Holland as well. In fact, that's where the phrase Dutch disease came from. They discovered gas, the other parts of the economy suffered. But that debate was happening in Ghana. So I wrote this article which was carried all over the world, Ghana defying the Garden of Eden syndrome. But I was also hoping, again, generally, the article meant to provoke Africans to say, let's think about some of the mistakes we've made in the past. In fact, if you look at the period from the 70s to the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, people call that the lost decades of Africa. Those 3 decades. Things were bad. Let me show you some of the headlines that people had about Africa. Robert Copeland had an article called The Coming Anarchy. It was in the Atlantic magazine. That article described African countries. My country was #1, Sierra Leone, Congo, South Sudan, and the Balkans, that the world was going to face anarchy in the decade of the 2000s. There was another article in The Economist by 2000, Africa, the Hopeless Continent. Yeah, Africa, the Hopeless Continent. They followed up 2 months later, Africa, disease, HIV/AIDS. There was another one by Paul Collier. Some of you have seen the book by Paul Collier, The Bottom Billion. Yeah, he describes the 61 countries where you had the poorest. Obama was in his transition period. The 2-3 months before taking over, they saw him with a book. It had just come out, and he was reading it. Some of you have seen Fareed Zakaria on CNN. And he was talking about how the rest of the world had grown and American power had declined and other powers were emerging. But he said, those 3 decades that we missed were some of the decades where the world has seen the fastest growth rate in history. Global output increased from about 22.8 trillion to 53.3 trillion by 2007. This is before the financial crisis. Global trade increased by 133%. In other words, globalization was really in full gear. China, in that period, or less, China lifted over 500 million out of abject poverty. But in Africa, what happened? In that same period, poverty increased by 93 million people, became even poorer. Your own Ghana, by 1975, the economy had shrunk by 12%. Inflation at one point was 30% in Ghana and 116% by 1997. That was Africa. The world moving ahead, we were moving behind. That was the period of Afro-pessimism. And so in international development, when you talk about Africa, they say basket case. Forget about those people. They're always fighting. There's always disease and disaster. And of course, you saw all the programs, Live Aid and everything else, pushing Afro-pessimism in the minds of people. I even feel that it made our people depressed. We didn't even, because we couldn't see anything positive. So deliberately, as I said, I chose this topic because something else happened. By 2011, the headlines were different. The headlines were totally different by then. Suddenly, Africa was this continent of hope. Hope and opportunity. Something changed. And you can see the headlines. The Economist, Africa Rising. That was December 2011. It was the same Economist in 2000 who said hopeless continent. Yeah? Then they did another one, Aspiring Africa. By 2013, Time magazine could not be left behind. Africa Rising. And of course, Ghana, you were in the middle of this new positive energy. So you've always led, especially in West Africa. While we were in conflict, you were rising at that time. So you were part of this positive narrative. When the rest of the world was moving ahead, India, China, Malaysia, you got independence at the same time. You both, I think, celebrated 60 years of independence. Just go and compare your economies. How fast they grew and how much our own declined. You can't make those mistakes. That's why I wanted to give you that pass. And you can go and reference that. But where you are today is much, much better than our generation. Much, much better. And I just gave you some of the numbers. But these are projections. These are economists, businessmen, looking at our continent and seeing hope and opportunity. I want you to have the same. But there are no guarantees when you give projections. They are backed by assumptions. Yeah? And so let me highlight 5 constraints that might prevent us from achieving those projections if we are not careful. Number 1, how we manage demographic transition. I'll spend a little bit of time on that. I'll come back there. I'll spend quite a bit of time. How we manage your children, your grandchildren, that 1 billion people that are coming back. It can be an opportunity, or it can be one of the worst disasters we face. It can lead to chaos if we're not careful, and civil conflict. How we manage that will determine where we sit in the 21st century, whether you, our children, can capture the 21st century as the Chinese have done with the 20th and the Indians want to do with the 21st century. Second, we must, your generation must push Africa towards industrialization. We have no option to create jobs. I mean, you see already our people voting with their feet from the rural areas. They don't want to be in rural agriculture anymore. They want modern services. How we handle industrialization with all the mineral wealth we have, if we only consume it now and not invest in industrialization as the Asian tigers did, we will be in hell. So how we manage using natural capital to invest in diversification into industrialization will be key, and whether you will have the skills to manage that or work in those factories. Number three, we must invest in energy transitions and infrastructure. In fact, as you've heard from my CV, I've spent the last decade advocating for energy transitions around the world, but particularly fighting for energy access in Africa. Yeah, you can imagine Kwame Nkrumah's dream then. He was way ahead of his time. And you imagine about 50 years later, I am around the world with Kofi Annan and other people preaching about access to energy in Africa. Without access to energy, we cannot industrialize. Number four, enhance good governance. Corruption. Corruption is one of the things killing us the most. And indeed, in my article I wrote about Ghana back in 2010, I said, will oil create a new kleptocracy? A new kleptocracy that stifles off Ghanaian wealth and puts it in the Swiss bank? Was the question I was asking them. But I've been asking that question for 2 decades. I write articles about natural resources. One was posted in The Guardian and some other places. I was dealing with industrial development, but I never forgot about natural capital. Yeah. Will we add value to the iron ore, the bauxite, to create wealth in our economy, or we just ship it up? This population is growing so fast. How do we manage it? So let me talk about that a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, we will be adding another 1 billion brothers and sisters to our population by 2050. The uniqueness of Africa's youth bulge, we call it a youth bulge, is that the continent will be home to 29% of the world's population between the age of 15 to 24. The World Bank has described some of these youth transitions as follows. A productive citizenry goes through 5 transitions: learning, going to work, staying healthy, forming families, and exercising citizenship. I repeat, learning, going to work, staying healthy, forming families, and exercising citizenship. So by the time you're 25, you're supposed to be a full, productive adult with a family and carrying on life. A report by the International Labour Organization, however, states, it was a report in 2015, states, and I quote, "Under-education of the young workers remains a significant concern and an important hindrance to transformative growth in Africa." Yes, the population is rising, but most of them are undereducated. And that ILO believes will be the biggest headache for job creation. So when we talk about the informal sector hosting these uneducated or semi-educated young people, that's a problem. That's a problem. And we have to fix that. Otherwise, indeed, there will be problems. DFID has estimated in 2009 that we would need to invest almost 30 billion in education to address the shortfalls in the provision of suitable and safe learning environments. Accessing and becoming part of the global economy, a key precondition for turning the youth bulge into an advantage, would involve having world-class institutions of higher learning, like the University of Ghana, yeah? With seasoned teams of researchers, academics, scientists, all over the continent. Yes, we have to support tertiary education. When I was a grad student at University of Illinois looking at macroeconomics and investments in education. I used to fight with the professor of macroeconomics then. He was tied to free basic education. I agreed with him. But I also said to him, you are advising our African governments to focus on that at the expense of tertiary education. We need to do that, I fully agree. But we also need world-class research centers. We need our own equivalents of Berkeleys and MITs to adapt technology, to give us the next set of engineers that in fact will have homegrown African solutions. But I know in most African countries for about 3 decades, it's universal primary education. Good job. But I can tell you in my country, for 3 months, the university I went to, they've been on strike. They've been on strike. It bothers me. How can kids sit for 3 months after Ebola without being in school? Sometimes we pay the university professors 2 months after the end of the month. It means people don't treasure tertiary education. I had the privilege of being in the land-grant system in the United States. From University of Illinois to Cornell, and I was teaching at Michigan State. Every major state has one of these. It came in from the 1862 Maryland land-grant system to make sure the rural economy can grow. And they become research centers, but adaptive research to solve the problems of the communities and help United States become the breadbasket of the world. Till today, they are amongst the top research centers. So I am a strong advocate for research, adaptive research, new technologies to prepare our next scientists and our next businessmen of the world. Because when I visit my alma mater and other universities around the world, I see the role tertiary education has played, in fact, in building economies around the world. You know, I think we still live a little bit in the Garden of Eden. We dig the gold from the ground, we send it off. Yeah, the same with the bauxite. The same with cocoa and coffee. We dry it in the sun and we ship. No value addition. You tell me, why should Ghana not be the jewel maker of the world? Tell me. Why should Tiffany and others not come here to get the best jewelry designers, but we have to ship the gold out? You tell me why Guinea, with over 20% of the world's bauxite, why they have no smelter. Now when you talk about smelter, you begin to see that Kwame Nkrumah was right. Build a big dam, have power supply, and smelt bauxite for the world. That was his vision of Ghana. It is more true today, and it will be more true in 2050 than he ever saw in his life, because he never anticipated 2.2 billion Africans, half of them very young, without jobs, living in darkness, never. So Kwame Nkrumah already, that's what visionaries do. They don't have all the computing power we have. They just dream about the future. And Kwame Nkrumah saw something already. Why he said energy, value addition to bauxite, and we supply aluminum to the world. I give you another case. Sierra Leone. We're sitting on one of the purest and largest deposits of titanium. Titanium, everybody needs it, even to make the new Airbus A380. Yeah? Liberia, and we also have one of the largest deposits of iron ore, 10 to 15 billion tons. Liberia, same. Guinea, bauxite. 3 of the countries sitting on some of the most precious metals of the world. 3, Liberia, Guinea, Sierra Leone. Anytime you look at the Human Development Index, we're fighting for number 5 position from the bottom or being last. It bothers me seeing that. But the developmental state, there's a lot of debate today still about what a developmental state is. Some have their own answers. I'll give you the ones I like, because I have seen that it has worked. Leadership matters. Nothing happens by accident. And I need to say this because the Washington Consensus back in the 70s and 80s told us that everything should be laissez-faire. Open your borders and do everything, let everything flow. The Asians never did it. And I speak on authority. I led an industrial development agency for 8 years for the world. So I know what I'm talking about. Visiting factories in China, in Bangladesh, in other places, visiting Malaysia, Indonesia, China, India, and seeing how the industry grew. I said, but how did you do it? They said, we supported that. Industrialization never happens by accident. Never. Laissez-faire only? Never. And guess what? The country that opposes using industrial policy the most is the biggest user of industrial policy. Who knows what that is? The US of A. You can read, those of you who are in the business school, go and Google Danny Roddick at MIT. Danny documents, and I also taught in the US, agricultural policy is supported. The EU is one of the biggest users of subsidies for agriculture. Yes, there's a role for the state, but the state has to be a developmental state. Yeah? That literature has grown out since the 1960s, but more. It has been based on the experience of the Asian miracles. Japan before World War II and Hong Kong. China and the Republic of Korea. Singapore, Taiwan, the Taiwan province of China. Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, all of them have seen structural change and transformation in the last 20, 30 years. Because the government had a clear policy of ensuring power supply, ensuring that the roads were built to enhance systemic competitiveness, ensuring that the bureaucracy did not stifle business growth. Because sometimes you need a license to build a factory in Africa, you may have to sit for 3 months. No, not in Vietnam and other places. They want you to get that license already in a week because they need the jobs, they need the growth. So they attracted foreign investment. In conclusion, I leave you with 2 more slides. These are numbers I picked up about the mineral wealth we have. Africa may be holding anywhere from 70 to 90% of the world's cobalt, about the same amount of platinum, maybe 40–50% of the gold, about 90% of the chromium, manganese, uranium 33%, columbite, tantalite. Tantalite we need in our mobile phones and our computers. We are sitting again in the Garden of Eden on a lot of wealth. Can we use that wealth to invest in transformation? Can we use that wealth to create opportunities for the next generation? Can we use that wealth, in fact, to be the leaders of the 21st century, giving good education, high-class universities, so that, yes, our children, all 2.5 billion of them in 2050, can in fact capture the 21st century. To do that, we must align 4 things. I'll talk more about this tomorrow when I deal with energy and agriculture. For any major transformation, particularly in energy and long-term investment, you must align 4 things. Politics matters. It is politics that gives you your leadership. If you have the wrong leaders, they only think of today. If you have the wrong leaders, it will be corruption. In some of our countries, we celebrate the corrupt. Yeah? We see them as heroes because suddenly the guy builds 5 houses on an income of $500 a month, and we say he's a hero. Yeah, we don't praise our professors, our teachers, our engineers, those who are working honestly. In a lot of African countries, we have glorified corruption, and it is one of the worst diseases that kills development. Because it means the whole mindset is messed up. It is short term. It is siphoning wealth, not creating wealth. It is holding on to power by any means possible. You need the politics right. It gives you the right leadership. And you better engage and get those right leaders, millions of jobs. But the results are still coming out. You need that kind, as he said, Obama says, the audacity of hope. The belief that you can be great and Africa can be great again. So the politics matter. The politicians give you the policy because they have a ministry. They are also the guys in parliament who approve the contracts. The contracts for our minerals. Can they include some value addition here? They create the opportunities or they kill the opportunity. So politics gives you the right policy. Pricing matters. The public policies, how do we incentivize investment? Pricing, private sector like stability. The taxation system is a price tool. Yeah? How do we ensure environmental sustainability? The price signal will do that. And finally, partnerships is the last P. So politics, public policy, pricing, partnerships. Africa cannot do it alone. We need open economies that are trading with the rest of the world. That's what the Asians do. They don't close the economy. They ask the Europeans, what do you want in your market? We can make it for you. But come here and build a factory. That is the vision of the future. That's what you're supposed to do. Now I'm not just talking about it. I quit my job a year and a half ago to go back home and decide I'm running for president. Holy cow, I thought I was smart. That is tough. Of everything I have done, geopolitics leading global energy systems. Now I found myself in African politics. They do everything to kill new ideas. Yeah? I arrived in Sierra Leone August 22nd, 2015. A man who used to sit with kings and queens of Europe, visiting heads of states, advising Asian countries. On the 24th of August, I went to my party office. 200 young kids, unemployed, spitting at me, abusing my mother in front of me. Until today, I'm struggling to be a politician. It could be that I don't understand the game. Or it could be that I don't like the damn game. Because the game is keeping down our children, making them super poor. Now, if you're angry enough or ambitious enough, and you believe that Africa has hope, opportunity, transformation, and your generation, can in fact be the Bill Gates, be active in politics and take charge.